The relationship between President Bola Ahmed Tinubu and controversial Islamic cleric Sheikh Ahmad Gumi has become one of the most heated political conversations in Nigeria right now, and for good reason. Multiple civil society groups, human rights organizations, and even international observers are asking one simple question: why has Sheikh Gumi not been arrested despite his repeated controversial statements about terrorism and banditry? The cleric has found himself at the center of national debate after making statements that many Nigerians consider sympathetic to terrorists operating in the country's northwest region. Human rights groups including the Human Rights Writers Association, Campaign for Democracy, and the Southern Nigeria Youth Congress have all called on President Tinubu to order Gumi's immediate arrest and prosecution. These organizations argue that the cleric's rhetoric goes beyond free speech and crosses into territory that could be seen as providing moral support to armed groups terrorizing communities across northern Nigeria. What makes this situation particularly interesting is the timing. While these calls for arrest were growing louder in late December, President Tinubu was preparing for a state visit to Turkey in late January, and this is where the story gets really fascinating. You see, Sheikh Gumi himself had publicly suggested that Nigeria should seek military assistance from countries like Turkey, Pakistan, and China instead of the United States. This recommendation came after Gumi criticized American involvement in airstrikes against terrorist camps in Sokoto, which he described as turning Nigeria into a theater of war. The cleric argued on his social media platforms that if Nigeria needed external military support, it should turn to what he called neutral countries rather than the United States. Now, here is where things become truly intriguing. Just weeks after Gumi made these suggestions about Turkey, President Tinubu traveled to Ankara on January 27, 2026 for an official state visit with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. During this visit, both leaders signed 9 major agreements covering defense, security, counter-terrorism, intelligence sharing, military training, energy, education, media, and trade. President Erdogan publicly stated that Turkey would stand with Nigeria in its fight against terrorism and expand cooperation in military training and intelligence. The two nations committed to working toward a $5 billion trade volume between their countries. President Tinubu specifically mentioned adopting Turkish military training and expertise to address Nigeria's security challenges. So essentially, Nigeria did exactly what Sheikh Gumi had suggested, turning to Turkey for security partnership. This raises a critical question that many Nigerians are now asking: is Sheikh Gumi's influence on Nigeria's foreign policy decisions stronger than most people realize? The timing certainly makes people wonder. Some political observers believe this could explain why the government has been reluctant to arrest the cleric despite mounting pressure from civil rights groups. If you're enjoying this breakdown of what is really happening behind the scenes in Nigerian politics, please take a second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you do not miss any future updates. The Campaign for Democracy went as far as warning President Tinubu that failure to act on Gumi could lead to nationwide protests and backlash, saying the government's silence sends the wrong message to terrorists and makes it appear that political considerations are being placed above human lives. The Southern Nigeria Youth Congress even called for Gumi's son, who recently graduated from the Nigerian Defense Academy as a second lieutenant, to be removed from the Nigerian army due to potential conflict of interest. Meanwhile, it is important to note that false information has also circulated about Gumi. In late December, viral claims suggested that the United States and International Criminal Court had arrested him, but fact-checkers confirmed this was completely false. Gumi remained active online throughout that period and even gave interviews to BBC Pidgin and hosted Facebook live streams in early January. His statements during this time continued to be controversial. He argued that Fulani herdsmen and bandits do not attack without cause and are on revenge missions rather than waging unprovoked violence. He advocated for amnesty and negotiation rather than military action, and he specifically criticized the focus on Sokoto during the American airstrikes, describing it as symbolic of what he called a neo-crusade war against Islam. The context matters here. Nigeria is dealing with serious security challenges. Back in September, a coup plot to overthrow and possibly kill President Tinubu was uncovered and foiled by security agencies. Military officers involved in planning this coup were arrested, and the investigation only became public in late January when the military acknowledged that officers had indeed plotted to illegally overthrow the government. This security atmosphere makes the question of Gumi's statements even more sensitive. Critics argue that in a time when the government is fighting actual coup plotters and terrorists, someone making statements that could be interpreted as sympathetic to armed groups should face legal consequences. But supporters of the cleric might argue he is simply advocating for dialogue and peace rather than military confrontation. The political reality is that Sheikh Gumi holds considerable influence in certain northern communities, particularly among some Fulani groups. This gives him a unique position that the government may be trying to navigate carefully. Some analysts suggest that arresting him could potentially inflame tensions in regions already dealing with insecurity, while others argue that not arresting him sets a dangerous precedent that influential figures are above the law. The Turkey angle adds another layer to this complex situation. Turkey itself is reportedly in advanced talks to join a strategic mutual defense agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which some are calling an Islamic security coalition. If Turkey becomes part of this alliance and Nigeria deepens its security partnership with Turkey, it creates an interesting geopolitical alignment. Nigeria would essentially be moving closer to countries that Sheikh Gumi specifically recommended, which raises questions about whether his public statements reflect broader conversations happening behind closed doors in government circles. President Tinubu returned to Abuja on Saturday night after concluding the Turkey visit, and now the focus shifts back to domestic issues. Will the government finally respond to the mounting calls for action against Sheikh Gumi, or will the status quo continue? The 9 agreements signed with Turkey show that Nigeria is serious about diversifying its security partnerships beyond traditional Western allies. The deal includes specific provisions for Turkish assistance in counter-terrorism, which is exactly the area where Gumi has been most vocal. What makes this entire situation so compelling is that it touches on fundamental questions about free speech, national security, political influence, and foreign policy. When does controversial speech cross the line to something actionable? Should religious and community leaders be held to different standards than ordinary citizens? How much influence should any single individual have on a nation's strategic decisions? These are not easy questions to answer. Drop your thoughts in the comment section below. Do you think the government should arrest Gumi as these organizations are demanding, or do you believe his statements fall within the bounds of free expression? And what do you make of the timing between his suggestions about Turkey and the president's state visit? This conversation is far from over, and as we head deeper into the political calendar with elections approaching, expect this issue to remain in the headlines.